delighted to have you join us. Thank you, Christy. Delighted to have you join us for the 2023 edition of our annual Wow or Yeow FDA Outlook webinar, jointly organized by Kinexum, a regulatory and clinical consulting firm, Hogan Lovells, an international law firm with a large food and drug law practice, and Hyman, Phelps McNamara, a specialist law firm with the largest dedicated FDA practice in the US. We have a chock-a-block set of topics to cover, so I just want to remind you to enter your questions in the chat column, and the panel will try to get to as many of those as we have time for in the last segment of the webinar. Just to warm up the chat function, those of you who are willing, please say hi in the chat and from where you're logging in. A recording of this webcast will be posted over the weekend, and a transcript will follow. And I'll now turn the mic over to our moderator, Dr. Zan Fleming, Kinexum founder and executive chairman, and an FDA alumnus. Zan?
Thank you, Thomas. And we do have a wow panel and much to cover. So let's dive in. And it's a tradition for us to start with Dave Fox, FDA's year in review that he does so well. Dave Fox is a partner at Hogan, and he and I go way back to early days of FDA, where he was associate chief counsel charged with keeping me out of trouble. Sorry, just kidding, but or at least I enjoyed working with Dave a great deal back then. Dave is a master resource and my go-to expert for a very broad range of drug and biotech product development and approval issues. Dave now serves on the firm's global life science management team. So Dave, take it away.
Well, thank you, Zan. We appreciate it. I'm going to start, as I do every year, by apologizing in advance for what you're about to hear. I'm speaking only for myself, which is a good thing, because an approximation of the truth. It's shaped to meet the irreverent spirit of Yeow or Wow, and also Zan and Thomas's drastic time constraints. So here's a 1 year in hopefully 10 minutes. So into the numbers. So 37 approvals from CDER, 8 from CBER, a total of 45 new approvals. I imagine you're all close readers of the trade press, so you've seen the headlines. This is about a 25% drop in the numbers from what we've seen in recent years. If you look at it the way the pink sheet looks at it, with a 15-year look back, this is a straight-on regression to the mean. 37 CDER approvals is right on point. That's about the average over 15 years. If you look at it the way CDER does in its annual report, over a 10-year period, it's about 15% off the mean. And if you look at it the way I do, which is over the last 5 years, or roughly the last PDUFA cycle, it's about 30% off the mean. So 37 CDER approvals, a pretty weak year by the numbers. But let's dig a little deeper. About half of them involve novel mechanisms of action. So about half first-in-class products, not bad. More than half, as always, rare diseases. Significantly more than half use an expedited program, priority review, fast track, breakthrough, accelerated approval, all more or less in line with the usual numbers. Oncology, as always, drives the numbers. 13 approvals this year versus 17 last year, not really a material difference. We did see a spike in approvals in dermatology. That was the standout. They were second to oncology. So again, those numbers are all strong, and a pretty even distribution. If you look at the, some of the major therapeutic areas, hematology, neurology, infectious disease, kind of defined broadly, even ophthalmology. So, a good spread of approvals, but nothing in pain, nothing really in allergy, nothing in psychiatry, very little in imaging. So those were weak. The inventory, however, as again, I think this is really aptly captured in the trade press, was there for a strong year. There were 70 applications up for approval in 2022, but only 6 in 10 actually made it over the finish line, which is really, I mean, that is pretty troubling. And half required or requested a new clinical study. And that, I think, is really startling. So it wasn't just inspectional issues. It wasn't just, COVID legacy, inability of FDA to do a pre-approval inspection that drove those numbers. There were some very significant disagreements between the agency and sponsors over the adequacy of the data, which I think does, it could be a variety of things. It could be the targets that are getting tougher. It could be novel clinical study designs, interpretation of data. But it also may be a comment on the status of the interactions between the agency and the industry in terms of getting feedback. We're seeing, just this continued trend toward written responses only for sponsor meetings. Maybe we're seeing the effects of meet from home as opposed to the old line suiting up and going to the Park Lawn building for you old timers, or to White Oak, and maybe without the urgency of COVID, when FDA was particularly productive, without that urgency, maybe we're starting to see the effects of a little bit of distance between the principals at FDA and the principals in the industry. Now, what could change some of that? We're seeing, we have a new mechanism under the new PDUFA. If you haven't looked at it, I strongly recommend you do type D meetings, which is an effort to allow sponsors to get 2-3 questions answered from a limited number of disciplines on a short time span. So a kind of targeted feedback mechanism has been added, which I think is helpful. We are going to see, now the implementation of accelerated approval reform. And I should have noted, accelerated approvals were cut in half in 2022. So only 6 accelerated approvals versus a historical norm of about 12 per year. Now, the chatter is that, the trend away from accelerated approval or the lower numbers is going to continue because industry will be scared off by the new requirements, which are essentially that you have to have your confirmatory study set up before you get your accelerated approval, and that FDA has will have more rapid means of withdrawing your approval. But it could be that actually strengthens the accelerated approval program and makes it more attractive and more open with the assurance that you have a study already underway. So we'll see. And then the last I'll note that was continue to be down for the year, and I think continues to be troubling, are advisory committee meetings. We're still in the really low teens, 10, 11, 12 advisory committee meetings per year for novel therapeutics and significant supplemental applications. And I think what we've seen is that everyone benefits when the agency goes to an AdCom. We saw Ardelyx get a serious complete response letter turned around through an AdCom and an appeal process. And then, of course, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, and I'm sure many of you followed, Amylyx had 2 advisory committee meetings in the span of 1 review cycle, with the second AdCom essentially reversing the first AdCom. More or less the same panel, but reaching a different conclusion. So I think the AdCom essential component to trying to maintain the numbers that we've gotten used to. In terms of other kind of notable upswings, I'd be remiss if I did not mention biosimilars. We're really seeing the maturation of the program. We're now up to a total of 40 biosimilars approvals, 7 in 2022 against a total of 5 reference products, all big name targets: Avastin, Lucentis, Neulasta, Ubera, and Neupogen. And then we had 2 more interchangeable biologics. These are like pharmacy substitutes in the biosimilars area. one against Lantus, and one against Neupogen, for a total of 4 categories of interchangeable biologics. So that program continues to grow slowly, very deliberately, but that is the big story ahead. And then last, what's going to drive the numbers? What's going to change the numbers materially going forward? My own takeaway from what I'm seeing, this is no great revelation, but RNA therapeutics. RNA therapeutics are just bursting. I think as a regulatory geek, I think the interesting question is, what numbers will the RNA therapeutics affect? Are they drugs? When are they drugs, and when are they biologics? And that's a very interesting regulatory question that we're going to be confronting. So let me move now to standout approvals for 2022. I always like to pick out a few for this group. I mean, really, a standout approval really depends on your interests. There are some wonderful new products in the rare disease space, just everywhere, and I can't cover them. So what I try to do is I pick out the ones that would be most interesting to the real regulatory nerds. So with that in mind, let me tell you about a few. And for semi-disclosure, I was involved in a few of these, but I won't tell you which ones to protect the innocent. So first on the list is Ferring's Rebiota, which is fecal microbiota live. This is the first true therapeutic in the microbiome space, and another area that I think we're just at the beginning of seeing, the industry come through with some really remarkable therapeutics. So this is essentially a human fecal transplant to repopulate the microbiome after aggressive antibiotic therapy to address a recurrent C. difficile infection, essentially a traveler's diarrhea. These types of products that are derived from natural sources and retain all of the complexity of a natural product are always of interest to the regulatory types. I strongly recommend that you look at the labeling and the review documents. And this product also went to an advisory committee. It's an orphan product, and there are others who are also seeking approval in this space, and that's going to raise some very interesting issues. Second, Amylyx's Relivrio for ALS. Any ALS product, is a headline. It's such a tragic, serious disease. From the regulatory perspective, yes, can't miss the fact that it went through 2 advisory committee meetings in the same review cycle. And what's very interesting, if you dig in, is to see how the regulatory question as posed by the agency in the 2 advisory committee meetings changed over time. From the initial meeting asking whether a single study was highly persuasive, to the second meeting asking whether the single study plus confirmatory evidence was persuasive. So there was a very marked shift in the way FDA defined the regulatory question. And then that in turn, you could see how that drove the debate at the advisory committee and potentially drove the outcome. In addition, the confirmatory evidence came from within the single pivotal study, which was a very interesting development, as well as some really sophisticated analysis on the natural history of the disease in comparison to what was seen in the clinical study. So lots to dig into on that approval. Just really a fantastic accomplishment all around. Third, this is not so much a regulatory geek one, but I'll get to it in a second. In the endocrine metabolic space, not only 2 real standout approvals in that space this year, but one of them, Lilly's tirzepatide, is probably the product that would be the game changer for the largest population of the products approved. A remarkable product, dual mechanism product, building off of what we've already seen in the GLP-1 RA class. The GLP-1 RA class was kind of the flashiest story of the year. with weight loss indication, and all I hear about from my friends and friends of friends on the West Coast is everybody is on a GLP-1 RA product. That's the hot new thing, and I'll leave that alone. But the complement to that approval, I think, which is really interesting, is and I apologize if I'm not saying this correctly, Tzield from Prevention Bio, which is a product that is approved to delay the onset of stage 3 serious type 1 diabetes. Now, I'm drawn to this from the regulatory perspective because anytime FDA approves a product to delay or prevent the onset of disease, as opposed to treat the disease, it is a signal moment. Very, very tough risk-benefit proposition for when you're treating people before they actually have the disease. And this one, I mean, this one we could debate for a very long time. I know Zan has strong feelings about it, and this is really in Zan's wheelhouse, so I'll leave it alone. But for those, again, who are looking for those kind of unique stories, I would look at the record for that approval. Next up, we couldn't get through this without talking about Leqembi and Alzheimer's disease. So last year's session, everyone was talking about Aduhelm. Everyone was, had very strong feelings about it. And what stood out to me, what was something that Frank Sosnowski said last year, when everyone was really, in a lather over Aduhelm, is he said that the story on the amyloid story has not been fully written yet, and he kind of told all of us to calm down and watch, and now we have a new approval, same endpoint, very quiet, not the same uproar, but then I had this written, and then yesterday I think Kate Rawson pointed out the Lilly product, I think it's Lilly's product, was not given approval. And I think we're going to talk about that. So as Frank said, the amyloid endpoint story has not been fully written. Where that story takes us, remains to be seen. Then two last ones. These are not NMEs, so this is a little bit off the topic, but I just want to point them out. One is Xeloda, capecitabine, which was the first product that fell under FDA's Project Renewal program. So this is a program led primarily by the Oncology Center for Excellence to go back and try to bring current older oncology labels. So Xeloda historically was approved for colon and breast cancer in fairly narrow segments. And in December, I think middle of December, FDA approved 8 efficacy supplements all on the same day, all based on literature, to significantly expand the labeling to include now pancreatic, esophageal, and gastric cancers, and significantly broaden the colon and breast cancer indications, as well as make some changes to dosing. They all based on essentially input from experts and interpretation of published data, much of which is not even kind of explicated in the labeling of the product. So again, for the regulatory nerds, I highly recommend you take a look at that. That's very interesting, and is that the beginning of a trend of going back now and modernizing labeling based on published literature? And then the last one, this is a really obscure one, but I took a look at the approvals, the supplemental approvals, most of which are for relatively new drugs where another indication was added. But I went back and looked at the oldest drug that fell into this category, and it's a drug from a company called Fennec Pharmaceuticals. Drug is Pedmark, sodium thiosulfate, which was approved originally for cyanide poisoning and now has been repurposed in 2022 for hearing loss in children on platinum chemotherapy. So I thought that was a wow. I think that's just great, and I think a good place to end. So thank you, everybody. And again, as much as it was a low year in numbers, once you dig into the approvals, you can always find some really exciting, really interesting, and some real wow candidates.
Wow. Well, thank you, David. We'll be coming back to some of those topics in a moment. But let's go on to Kate Rawson, who is one of the most astute and up on everything analyst and observer of FDA that I know. She is senior editor at Provision Policy and brings more than 25 years of experience covering FDA regulated industries. Among the many things she's done is to help launch and be a senior editor at the Pink Sheet. And she did serve as the managing editor of the Rose Sheet, which, though is not around, it is aptly named because it covered the cosmetic industry. So Kate, give us your take on some of the big picture issues for the agency.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Zan, so much for that introduction. I hope I can live up to it. I thought that just to pick up for a minute on what Dave Fox had said, the advisory committee meetings are always really interesting for us. That's kind of our bread and butter at Provision Policy, and just what you've seen over the past couple of years is a real drop off in the number of products that are going to a committee, which is too bad because David, as you said, it's a lot less transparency as to why the agency does or doesn't approve something. And I was just looking back at the last few years. This is the third year where if you don't include the EUAs, more than half of the products that went to committee were rejected by the committee, and that's historically sort of pre-corona. Or pre-COVID, you're seeing more of like a 70% yes rate. So I think FDA is being really, really particular about the products that it brings to committee. I think a lot of that has to do with just, as we know, those committee meetings take a lot of time and energy. And so that's definitely a trend that we're going to see, that we're going to watch. And the other thing I'll just mention about that, and then I'm going to get into what I am going to be covering as well, is that one thing that Commissioner Califf has talked about for 2023 is an update to the advisory committee process. And one of the things that he has said might be included in that is a re-review of products that go to committee, get a no vote, and then instead of being approved anyway, or for FDA making, issuing a complete response, to bring it back to committee again. So we might start seeing more committee meetings in the future. But so I just wanted to respond to that because I do like to geek out on advisory committee meetings. So I'm going to go even bigger picture and step out just a minute and talk for a little bit about what the midterms mean for FDA, the elections that we just had, and then focus a little bit on what Commissioner Califf's priorities are going to be for the next couple of years that he has left, that he said he has left at the helm of FDA. So, the midterms, we didn't see that red wave that a lot were predicting, but there were still enough changes, certainly with the change in party on the House side, as well as the Senate committee level, to shake things up for FDA. I think, most obvious on that, if we're starting in the Senate, is that, despite the fact that the Democrats retained control and even picked up a seat, there is likely to be a tougher oversight climate for FDA. And I think, this is most obvious in the change of leadership in the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, or Health Committee, with Vermont's Bernie Sanders as the new chair. We all know Senator Sanders is the de facto leader of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. He's also at the top of the list of some of the most vocal critics of brand name drug pricing and industry commercial practices in general. And while the former chair, and that was Washington State's Patty Murray, who's moved over to chair the Appropriations Committee, she was certainly no industry ally, but there is going to be still a pretty sharp change in tone with a Sanders chaired committee. In addition to industry commercial practices, Senator Sanders is also a critic of FDA Commissioner Rob Califf, He voted against Caliph's confirmation in both cycles. And, you know, as chair of the health committee, he's going to have a ready platform to press his concerns about industry influence over FDA should he choose to do so. On the Republican side of health, you have Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy as the new ranking member. He's certainly not afraid to criticize FDA, but he generally fits within the Republican consensus that the agency is, for the most part, on the right track in its approach to drug regulation. So you probably won't see much heat from Senator Cassidy, but of course it will be Senator Sanders and who will be setting the agenda with the Democrats for the next couple of years. On the House side, I think FDA is probably less likely to be in the hot seat there. On healthcare issues, the Republicans are much more likely to press on the drug pricing provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, since the IRA, as you recall, was passed without any Republican support, the GOP can use their new chair post on energy and commerce, and that's Washington's Kathy McMorris Rogers, for aggressive oversight on certain provisions, including Medicare's new prescription drug negotiating authority. So, you know, there's a repeal of the IRA is not possible without Republican control of the Senate and the White House, but GOP oversight during most of the key implementation periods will be extremely important for innovator companies. The only thing I'll just mention is that I live in Maryland, and the sole Republican in the Maryland among the Maryland representatives is Andy Harris, and it's been announced that he will chair the Appropriations Committee in the House that oversees FDA. He's a little bit of a wild card, as been seen in some of his comments and actions during the height of the COVID pandemic. So, you know, he could come down hard on FDA and Commissioner Califf during appropriation hearings. Couple of FDA related issues that I just want to mention that could get attention from a GOP led House. Access to RU486, that's mifepristone, the medical abortion drug that had already been an issue for Commissioner Califf during his most recent confirmation. And then in a similar vein, FDA's review of a potential OTC switch for oral contraceptives could become a flashpoint. You know, on that issue, FDA has scheduled an advisory committee review. This is a PPAR-agonist switch application for an oral contraceptive O-pill in November. That's one of the big OTC switches that we may see this year. That meeting has been postponed. If FDA, you know, reschedules it as promised, it could be held while Republicans have control in the House. So just something to mention as a potential flashpoint, and maybe some hearings on the Hill, or at least some chatter there. I want to pivot just a little bit and talk about Commissioner Califf and what his priorities will be for the next couple of years. You know, it's important to note, I think the good news is that he has announced that he will stay on until the end of President Biden's first term. So, you know, there will be stability at the helm of FDA, at least until the end of 2024. And given the vacancies that we've had in the short terms that we've had in the past in the last really 10 years, I think that'll be good news for everyone. You know, compared to where we were a year ago when we were all together, I think the commissioner is much freer now to pursue his chosen priorities now that the emergency phase of the pandemic is over. And there will always be an infant formula crisis or a food safety issue, but I think it gives him a little bit more room to talk about what he wants to focus on. And those are really two big meta issues. One is transforming evidence generation, and the other is combating misinformation. So, you know, combating misinformation, I'll tackle that one first. That's something Califf knows quite a bit about from his time at Alphabet, the Google parent. He's talked about the fact that government cannot solve this issue alone, given that there's already so much mistrust in science in general that we've seen over the last couple of years, and certainly in regulatory and scientific agencies. And he's talked about the need for a network of people that are committed to the promulgation of reliable and truthful information. But he's also admitted that he really doesn't have a very good solution to this problem, and that he's talked to anyone he can talk to about how to address misinformation, and is coming up short. So one idea, and I'd be interested to hear what our attorneys on the panel think about this, but he said that he's working on some sort of limited safe harbor for sponsors to defend their products without complying with the normal restrictions on advertising and promotion. That's something that he says he is actively pursuing. I'm not sure how that would play out in practice, so would love to hear what others think about that. So the other meta issue that Caliph sees facing FDA and industry is a need to improve the clinical trial enterprise. And this seems to be where he really wants to make his mark for the remainder of his time at FDA. So this includes increased diversity of clinical trial participants, expanded use of real-world data to support regulatory decisions, and the creation of data sharing systems. As we know, he's a former clinical trialist at Duke. And so finding better mechanisms for evidence generation is really one of his long-standing areas of interest. He came back into the commissionership position under the Biden administration with really a heightened interest in expanding the agency's use of new rigorous sources of data. And I think here, the emphasis on clinical trial demographics and methods in the FDA Omnibus Reform Act, or what we're calling Fedora, may serve as a jumping off point for Caliph to really advance a broader trial modernization initiative as a legacy project in his second term as head of the agency. So just to recall, Congress passed a clean authorization of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act at the 11th hour last year. But when they did that, they left a lot of provisions on the table, and some of which they knew needed to be reauthorized, like best pharmaceuticals for children, orphan drug grants. And then there were also some other provisions in there that have been discussed over the years, but kind of fell off of the clean PDUFA, like regulation of laboratory developed tests, which is the VALID Act, accelerated approval provisions to give that program some more regulatory teeth, cosmetics regulations, for example. So Fedora, which ended up getting wrapped up in the omnibus package and passed during the lame duck session, did include some of those provisions like AA and cosmetics, but it also incorporated a series of provisions under the heading clinical trial diversity and modernization. So while the primary probably motivation at the political level for these measures is really concern and well-placed and necessary concern about increasing clinical trial diversity and representation in previously underserved populations, the provisions really will fit well with Caliph's longstanding interest in reinventing the clinical trial enterprise. And there's a lot packed in there, but the provisions relate to decentralized trials, digital tools, innovative trial designs. Those are the parts that are most likely to be the most significant for FDA and Caliph to advance ideas for transforming the conduct of clinical trial research in the near term. So there are going to be a lot of public meetings and guidances on all of these topics in the months to come. And the last thing I'll say about this is that we've already started to see movement on this. There was this is something that the Oncology Center of Excellence had already put forward with its Project Equity program, where now there was a guidance issued, almost a year ago now, maybe 9 months ago, that says that all IND holders should plan to submit a race and ethnicity diversity plan by the time they reach the end of phase 2 meeting stage at the latest. So we're already seeing a lot of interest and movement on this, and the Fedora provisions will only continue to push this forward. Lastly, I'm just gonna look ahead really quickly. As far as Caliph's priorities are concerned, he's gonna continue to focus on the response to the opioid crisis, FDA released an opioid prevention framework in August, and a key part of that, and a priority of Kitalys, is enabling an OT switch of naloxone. That's the other big switch this year, besides Opill, the contraception. And he also needs to support the reauthorization of the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act, which could be used as a potential vehicle for the VALID Act. And maybe we'll see if our dietary supplement friends think, there could be some that could also serve as a rider for some of those regulations that fell off the Fedora bus. And then most recently, and I'll end on this, he's expressed an interest in developing frameworks and strategies to address common chronic diseases and mental health, and that has made an argument recently that industry really isn't focusing enough on the big, still those big primary care, big market products. And he really seems to pit that a bit against industry's interest in developing targeted products for smaller markets. And I know later maybe we can get into some of the IRA provisions and the incentives there, and how that kind of works against small market or at least small molecule drug products. But maybe I'll end there in the interest of time.
Okay, you fully delivered on my vaulted description of your profile, so thank you. Let's now go on to Kellyanne, and another sterling expert on our panel. Kellyanne Payne is a partner at Hogan, and she expertly dwells in the device world, supporting strategic development of medical devices and diagnostics, as well as submissions of pre-market applications and for those products. And she served previously as an in-house corporate counsel for QVC. So Kellyanne has great experience. And Kelly, so much going on at CDRH. Take it away.
Yeah, a lot going on at CDRH. I would say kind of similar to the drug side of things. It seemed a little quieter this year. I would say, like for de novo applications, for example, we were down by about 10 de novos. So we went from about 30 to 20 in the de novo space as far as de novo requests being granted this year. It just gives you an example kind of what we're seeing. And I would say what's missing from the de novos that were granted this year are largely machine learning or AI-based devices, which we saw quite a bit of last year. It seems that people are filing 510Ks on top of already cleared devices for those types of technologies. So there's a good number out there that are serving as predicate devices for the 510K pathway. That said, I think we'll see more de novos this coming year. I think we'll see them in the mental health space for a lot of AI or digital health based devices. An example of that is the publicly available breakthrough designation given to Oxford VR for their anxious avoidance CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy digital device. And so I think we'll see others in that space following on the heels of Akili, which has the ADHD device. So I do think we'll see more there. FDA also came out with the clinical decision support final guidance document this year. So I think that'll change some things. They added a time criticality function to that guidance. And they noted things such as sepsis calculators in EHR systems that will be required to be regulated by the agency likely. So I think that's a switch as well, where we might start to see more de novos come in for devices such as that. Also in the omnibus, there was what we call the provision for predetermined change control plans with FDA, PCCPs. And I think these were mentioned last year, but there's been bit of a switch. We were being told in the past that we needed a de novo or to develop special controls to enforce those change control plans in the field for AI-based devices. The omnibus would now allow those to go through a 510K. They did note that any changes in the field made through a PCCP could not stand in as a predicate for future devices. So they put that limitation on. And with PCCPs, FDA expects usually the changes in the field to be superior, not substantially equivalent. So there has to be a performance increase. So that is an interesting development and something a lot of people were looking forward to. And we're also still looking forward to a guidance document from FDA on the types of changes that could be incorporated into those predetermined change control plans. They will give sponsors some flexibility who have AI-based devices to not have to come back to FDA for every modification made to those devices in the field. This year, we go another year without seeing any device indicated for Alzheimer's from CDRH. So that is, a missing element I think people are still looking forward to. So I think that's largely the year end. There was a PMA this year that came out in the orthopedic space. We're starting, the traditional devices are still getting PMA approval. One was CardiHeal for their calcium carbonate insert for knee lesions. And so that went pretty smoothly through FDA on the PMA side. And again, a lot of 510K notices. We're seeing, iterations of AI algorithms. FDA is being somewhat flexible and allowing one indication to serve as a predicate for, say, another similar indication. So taking, a fracture clearance and allowing it to be a predicate for a mammography device because, they're both identifying something on an image. And so some flexibility on the 510K side. But that's largely what I'm seeing on CDRH's side. And I know there's others behind me, so I'll let them talk, and I'm happy to answer questions during the discussion period.
Well, terrific. We'll be coming back very shortly. Riet Van Locht is quite an amazing story in her career and change thereof. She worked as a food scientist with a PhD before she went back to law school, and then on to Hyman, Phelps McNamara, where for many years she's provided counsel on over-the-counter products, including food and dietary supplements, over-the-counter drugs, cosmetics, and animal feed and drugs. And all this across a very wide range of FDA, USDA, FTC, and Consumer Product Safety Commission issues. So we're delighted to have for the first time Riet Van Locht join us. Riet, tell us about the F in FDA.
Well, thank you for the introduction. The F in FDA has been silent for a long time, but the last year became pretty noticeable because F does not only stand for the grade that the F in FDA got, but there were a lot of food issues that came on the forefront. Of course, I'm pretty much sure that everybody on this call has heard about the infant formula mess that was created, and then the F in FDA became more visible to everybody. There was a report by Political which basically said it's a gigantic mess. FDA, and then the food group, the Center for Food Safety and Nutrition. Many people did not know about CIFSA, but now more people know about that. There's a disorganization, structural issues, decisions are not made. There is infighting. There's all kind of issues. There's many regulations that are implementations of laws that the regulations are there, but FDA doesn't seem to make progress on these issues or the system. The agricultural water for produce, there's a rule that the law has been passed. The Food Safety Modernization Act was passed in 2011, and now we're in 2023, and we're still dealing with the issue. What is going on? There is infant formula issues, there is heavy metal issues, there's nutrition issues, the dietary guidance. This USDA publishes dietary guidance every 5 years. Nutrition seems to not make progress. We get more and more issues because people have unhealthy food. So the infant formula crisis resulted in FDA internal investigation. There was a report published, and then there were questions, more and more questions, and then we got the Reagan-Udall report, which was published what was it, in October, November last year, basically came to the same conclusion as the political report was, that there is, what did they say? It looks like a football field. Anyway, it's a chaos theory. You know, there's chaos. Different people don't know who to report to. The different, you know, there's not like really completely silos, but there's just no communication, and there's no ultimate decision maker, or, you know, nobody that, there's not a line of command. So the report suggested some corrections, and one of them basically new restructuring of the organization in CIFSAN, and this all resulted in, as has been happening before, a call for a single food safety agency or single food agency, or some form that maybe not be part of FDA, so that you would get maybe DA, which some people think that the F stands for federal, not for food. So that would, you know, they could still have an FDA, just change the meaning of the abbreviation, and then have a different agency on the HHS, so that that is more clear and gets higher priorities, so that the F is not so silent anymore. This call for single food safety agency or single food agency is nothing new, has happened more than the 17 years that I have been doing this kind of work. And so I don't know if it's going to happen. Actually, I think it was 2 days ago, there was an article in the paper and about this. And one of the things that was repeatedly mentioned in the comments is because there is also a funding issue. There's, you know, it's not a priority. I mean, drugs and devices and even tobacco, they get much higher priorities than food, which, you know, we all eat. And it's the food-borne diseases are a big issue. All the outbreaks are very costly, but also our general health. We have still a very, you know, mortality because diabetes, we have heart diseases, all that stuff. And it's all related to nutrition, which is food. Anyway, so will we see a single food safety agency in the future? I predict that I will be retired by the time that might happen, if ever. But hopefully, at least there will be a restructuring in the way that the chain of command gets easier, and that there's no more infighting, and that things become more effective. Because it is very frustrating for the industry too. Certain approval, there's not many products are, you know, FDA, the food side is much post-market enforcement and not pre-market approval. But certain things that we need to get done from FDA don't get done. So that was a major, major negative last year. I think that the positive for last year is that FDA issued a proposal for the healthy definition. It's what they call a nutrient content claim, and foods that meet certain requirements can be called healthy. There has been, since FDA issued the proposed regulations for, or the final regulations, amended regulations for nutrition labeling, added sugar has become a big issue. The healthy definition did not take into account added sugar. There has been a lot of private litigation on that aspect, and FDA's new definition is a big change from what we did in the past. In the past, it was very nutrient oriented, and you could just add nutrients to a product in many cases and make it healthy. Now it is much more food oriented and diet oriented, which is more consistent with the dietary guidance, which the diet guidance presumably will lead to healthier people, a better nutrition for us. And so that is a big change. That said, we will have to see where it goes. I think it is very consistent with the nutrition science, and that's what FDA claims too, but it's still very hard to see how that will be implemented in practice. So that was a positive. And other negative, one of the things I talked about food and the single food agency. One of the things that people tend to forget is dietary supplements are foods. And in all this, these reports, it was the focus on food and food safety and nutrition, not so much on dietary supplements, because dietary supplements are sort of in between. But FDA also, in the opinion of many people, has not been so favorable looking at dietary supplements. And one of the main things that they have been doing the last couple of years and last year, again, is there is a provision in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that says if you have a new dietary ingredient, if it is marketed before the product is investigated as a drug or approved as a drug, and it is valid, and otherwise it's a race to market. Market it first as a dietary ingredient, then you're safe. If it's first marketed or investigated as a drug, then you can't market it as a dietary supplement. FDA has interpreted that provision in such a way, and that came very clear last year, that a company can be, marketing a product because there is, it has determined that the exclusionary clause does not apply. And then a couple of years later, FDA said, oh, wait a minute, there was an investigative new drug approval for this ingredient, so you can no longer market it. The way that FDA has interpreted that provision is in my mind, inconsistent with the law, and it seems also unworkable. So hopefully, and FDA has been very inconsistent with that, and so hopefully that will be addressed in the future via litigation or via statutory amendment or something. But it relates in a little bit, it relates in great uncertainty in the industry about if an ingredient is legal or not. And then the last thing that I want to mention, which I think is exciting and a positive thing, in the last year, FDA basically did its first, finished its first consultation for animal cell cultured product. So this is very briefly, instead of growing animals, having farm animals and killing them and all that, so we now are working, there's a big development and interest in growing cells in culture and making meat or animal products out of that. And so we are optimistic that in the foreseeable future, really in the foreseeable future, there may be actually that type of product on the market, not necessarily in the meat, the poultry, but more on the possibly the seafood, and even milk products, whatever, that are not from animals, but are animal similarities. They are animal cells, but they're not from animals, except for the original cells. So that's very exciting, and that's something that we are like, oh, wow, hopefully this will come to happen in the near future. So that's all for now.
Ria, thank you so much. Great to get coverage of the F and FDA. And we'll maybe come back to a few issues in a moment.
Sorry, I forgot my whole cosmetic part.
Oh, well, go ahead. Let's go to the
Sorry. And Kate already had mentioned that there is in Fedora, we have now a modernization of Cosmetic Regulation Act. And so that's an exciting event. We will see where it happens. What all happens, but basically there's now the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The C has gotten attention, and there's provisions that require FDA to issue regulations for good manufacturing practice. There's some other safety regulations. Industry will have to register facilities. There will be listing of the products, with mostly the ingredients, and the modernization, the MOCRA, as they call it in short, focuses very much on safety, so not so much on labeling. It will help with getting a bit more certainty and uniformity and regulation of cosmetics, and it will get them somewhat more credibility. Since now, people always say, oh, cosmetics are not regulated. Well, we will get more regulations, and so that's an exciting development. And we will see what happens the next year. Most provisions become effective after a year after the enactment, so the end of 2023, and then some regulations will have to be developed in the next 2 to 3 years. It actually, FDA got money for that work that they have to do. How, if they can do it, if they have enough resources as far as personnel, remains to be seen. But that's a new and exciting development in the cosmetic world.
All right, well, thanks again, Riyad. And now, last but not least, Frank Sazanowski, the director at Hyman, Phelps and McNamara, and a singularity, having helped secure over 100 approvals for more than or across a range of new molecular entities and cell and gene therapies. Many of these are for serious and rare conditions, his trademark specialty. Frank joined FDA in 1983 as regulatory counsel, where he was key to implementing not only the Orphan Drug Act, but the very important 1984 Hatch-Waxman law. So Frank, take it away.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate it. Always, this is what, our 6th or 7th year. It's a wonderful program that Kinexum puts on. Let me say this, that I just celebrated the 45th anniversary of my 25th birthday last Saturday. So with that perspective of time, I'm going to talk about 3 topics from the perspective of time. One is something that happened 25 years ago with the FDA Modernization Act, FDAMA 115. I think that's a huge wow. And then talk something about 35 years ago when the FDA, out of its creative genius, came up with the accelerated approval pathway to deal with the AIDS crisis. And then lastly, talk about this month is the 40th anniversary of the Orphan Drug Act. And I think all 3 of them are wow. I'm going to start with the one that's 25 years ago, the FDA Modernization Act. Why am I bringing up a law that's 25 years old as though it's a wow? Like, how can that be new? Well, let me just briefly explain. Carl Peck, when he left the FDA, the head of the Center for Drugs, he came up with this idea that we should have an alternative pathway to approval. At that time, to show substantial evidence of effectiveness, the only path was by adequate and well-controlled studies, which the FDA had always interpreted to be at least 2. So that had 2 positive, adequate and well-controlled studies. So he pioneered coming up with an alternative, which would be 1 adequate and well-controlled positive study plus confirmatory evidence. Now, in the meantime, FDA knew that this was happening, so the FDA came up with a guidance document on substantial clinical evidence of effectiveness, which said, by the way, there is another way. We will accept 1 highly statistically persuasive study if it's likely on something like irreversible morbidity and mortality, where it'd be unethical to do another trial. So we do have a pathway for 1 study. But remember, that's a very narrow pathway. What Carl was talking about, what got created in the law, was a very broad pathway, because it said you can have confirmatory evidence. So the question was, what constitutes confirmatory evidence? There was 1 workshop that Carl convened on that, and the key breakout session was, what does confirmatory evidence mean? And he asked Janet Woodcock and I to co-chair that, and so that's been published and stuff. So this has lain fallow for a long, long time. What do I mean by that? I tried to persuade my good friends, Janet Woodcock and Bob Temple, who co-authored that May 1998 Clinical Evidence Effectiveness Guidance document, that to revise it. And it took some time. Peter Stein, the head of the Office of New Drugs, at an Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases made a monumental breakthrough announcement in which at that Willard Hotel conference in September 2019, he said, I'm going to speak to what constitutes confirmatory evidence. First time publicly, FDA had done that. He showed a slide that showed 4 different ways you can have confirmatory evidence as illustrations. Now, he could do that because he knew OMB was already reviewing the draft guidance document that was going to be released in December 2019. So the guidance document came out using those same 4 examples that Peter Stein announced at the Every Life Foundation program. And so that was a groundbreaking sea change. Why do I say that? Because, you know, as Zan said, you know, I've had a finger in the world of rare diseases since 40 years ago. And it turns out my view is that most rare disease therapies are approved under that 1997 law. It might not be acknowledged by the FDA because they didn't have any guidance on it until December 2019. And I didn't even start to see FDA review division speak about it until spring of 2021. But now I can cite 2 examples. And for instance, Dave Fox brilliantly gave an overview of all what happened in 2022. He always does. And in that, he talked about Relivrio, a drug for ALS. And he talked about how the spring 2022 advisory committee said, does this meet the standard, that May 1998 standard of one highly statistically persuasive study? And the advisory committee said no, because it only had a p-value of 0.03. It wasn't highly statistically persuasive. But the question was changed in September 7th advisory committee. It was like, does it meet the confirmatory evidence, this 1997 law? And it did. You remember Dave talked about it, that there were 2 things, an open label extension, as well as some natural history. Natural history was one of the 4 things Peter Stein talked about, one of the 4 things that's in the December 2019 guidance. What's a little unusual about the use of natural history in this context is natural history, one of the things that the FDA is interested in looking at is how does natural history compare to the placebo arm? Because remember, one of the ways that you can see a between group difference if you do a study is what if by chance, especially in a rare disease, by chance, those who get randomized to placebo arm actually deteriorate faster than what you would expect. So you might see that would be a false positive. You would see a drug trial that was positive, but it was driven by something that had nothing to do with the pharmacological benefit of the intervention. So anyways, Relivrio is a good example of one of those types of ways you can have confirmatory evidence. Livmarli, a product for rare liver disease, Alagille. Its primary hallmark symptom is pruritus, itchiness. But what it did is it also showed it had a big effect on serum bile acids, which are mechanistically predictive of the clinical outcome, how it affects how patients feel or function. And so the FDA said, yes, you had a positive study, only one, wasn't highly statistically persuasive, but you know what you had? You had mechanistic information. And, over the time, we've always talked about biomarkers as being important. Biomarkers can be important for proof of concept. They can be very important for dose selection. But now biomarkers are important because they can be the second basis for the approval. Biomarkers as mechanistic information can be a type of confirmatory evidence that can complement your single adequate and well-controlled study. So now biomarkers take on a whole new level of significance in the drug trial armamentarium. So I think that it's a big wow to talk, and I could talk for days about this topic, but that's enough for that. Second topic, accelerated approval. Again, you heard Dave and Kate both talk about that. I think that my view of it, and it could be a little bit different, is that I view what happened in 2022 as a big wow for accelerated approval. And how can you say that? I mean, really, Frank, obviously your 70 years are showing you're getting senile, because how can it be a wow? Here's how I think it's a wow. I think it's a wow because I expected that when Frank Pallone first started coming out with ways to ratchet back on accelerated approval, they were pretty draconian. Senator Burr stood up to that and said, I won't take that in PDUFA 7. So what came out and what Kate was referring to in the omnibus, the Fedora provisions, are not really that significant. Okay, so I thought that the attack on accelerated approval would have had much sharper knives and it would have been eviscerated. It was not. In fact, it's largely intact the way it is. In fact, it could stand to have some improvement in terms of accelerating the path that the FDA can have to remove an approval. You know, I think that can still be looked at. But the point is that Dave very kindly referred back to something I said last year about Aduhelm, that the story of amyloid hasn't been written yet. And what I was saying is that accelerated approvals outside of cancer have been very important. Look what they did. When I was at the FDA and I had a very small part in helping to create the accelerated approval, look what it did for a death sentence. HIV was a death sentence back then. It's now a chronic condition because you know what? There have been something like 26 drugs approved by accelerated approval, which have changed that condition dramatically. The very first non-cancer, non-infectious disease accelerated approval is one I helped with, beta-seron for multiple sclerosis. I don't think beta-seron is that much prescribed. I have no idea. I didn't look at IMS America, but there's something like 19 other, MS drugs. So the first drug that gets approved by accelerated approval, like AZT for AIDS, doesn't have to be the best. Beta-seron doesn't have to be, but it opens up the floodgates to more research and encourages people to come in. Same thing, happened with other accelerated approvals. I'm thinking about eteplirsen. I had a hand with Sarepta's eteplirsen, first drug for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. I think we have 9 drugs now approved for DMD, for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. And so that's why I was saying with Aduhelm that the amyloid story is not over. So I think accelerated approval, what happened in 2022 is actually a wow, because we dodged in my view, we dodged a bullet. We had people like Ellis Unger, former FDAer who's now at my law firm. He said something at a congressional caucus on rare diseases that I chaired a panel on in February, in which he said when he was at FDA, he interpreted being reasonably likely to predict as meaning 70% of the time that therapy would actually convert into showing benefit. Now, that's not 90 or 95% of the time, which I think sometimes I get the feeling that some people believe it has to be that prognostic to be able to have an approval, but it's certainly not 50-50. So I think that we're moving forward. Now, the last thing I want to talk about was 40 years ago, the Orphan Drug Act. And the Orphan Drug Act, I think it's a wow. I mean, look what's happened. I mean, everybody cites that in the decade before the Orphan Drug Act, there were something like only 10 drugs approved for rare diseases. Now we have, 500 or something for, 350 different diseases. So it's remarkable what's happened in the 40 years since, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And how can we get a lot more done? Because to get to the 10,000 rare diseases at the rate at which we're doing it, it would probably take something to the year 2,350. And most people with a rare disease aren't going to live that long. So we need to accelerate the path of getting new therapies out for rare diseases. So flexibility, global statistical test, and the randomized control trial. I'm going to touch on each one in about a minute, just to give you a heads up. Flexibility is a concept, many say I helped to start, but I won't go into the history of that. But what I now see with time, and the reason why I mentioned I had a hand, because with time, I now see that maybe it's a concept that needs to be rethought. Because flexibility, when we tell FDA, as Billy Dunn said in his opening remarks at the September 7th Relivrio, the ALS Drugs Advisory Committee, when he cited FDA has a mandate, and he cited the FDA regulations at 312.80 and other places, where it says FDA is mandated to apply flexibility where there's a serious or life-threatening disease with unmet medical need. People understand they have greater risk. They'll accept more risk. They'll accept less certainty of benefit. He said, we have an obligation. Here's my problem with that. Billy Dunn is exactly right. That's something I've been saying for decades. But what I feel bad about is the pressure it puts on FDA officials, because they have no guidance as to how far, I call it coloring outside the lines, They're told we have an obligation to color outside the lines. That is, don't stick just to what a trialist would require you to do, because this is a rare, serious disease with an unmet medical need. Okay, that's fine in concept. But how far outside the lines can you color? What colors are you allowed to? When have you gone beyond that? So I think it puts an enormous personal pressure on FDA officials that is unfair. So maybe we have to think about coming up with something that will give them a bright line test, that will be more quantitative, something like the Emergency Use Authorization Authority, which says, the known and potential benefits should outweigh the known and potential risks. Then you can have some sort of quantification. That's one topic. Second topic is a global statistical test. One thing that I see emerging, there was an FDA official, Dr. Wang, spoke at an FDA mitochondrial disease workshop in 2019. And she said for rare diseases, what you should do is not look at one primary endpoint, but combine them. Because what you want to do is with a rare disease, there probably is going to be heterogeneously expressed among different symptoms and how it affects how people's function. And so you want to combine them. And so that way, because for any individual, they might be affected on one symptom more than another. And so you won't have a chance to be able to show a benefit. And if you only had those people, it would dilute out your ability to see between group difference, especially in a small trial. So she said an example she gave was Pompeii. She says you should not look at just 6-minute walk or pulmonary function tests like forced vital capacity, but combine the two. And she showed the power statistically to see a lot more. And you know what, when I've talked to FDA officials about this, the way you convert that, because it's almost like a Z-score. So how do you convert that to section 14, your clinical trial section, your labeling, so that it's meaningful to physicians? It's time. What you're doing with the relentlessly progressive disease is that when you combine these different things, you're looking at how much you're slowing the progression. So the common metric is time that you're measuring. So you're actually getting more to a disease-modifying therapy, which we would all want as a society, rather than merely symptomatic benefit by looking at one endpoint. And the last thing I wanted to say was RCTs. Whenever anybody comes up with a hierarchies of evidence, strength of evidence, RCTs are the gold standard. And it's true for common diseases. But for rare diseases, especially ultra rare diseases, I think we shouldn't incense at the altar of RCTs. I actually had an FDA review division tell a client of mine who has a very rare disease, I'll say less than 300 people known in the world. They said, look, why don't you do an RCT? Do 6 versus 3. Put 6 on drug, 3 on placebo. That's about. I went to my friend Bob Temple. I said, what are you going to learn? So I think then doing a run-in where you run people in for a year or 2 years on the same instrument. Sure, you're going to have some expectation bias when they have an intervention. You can kind of factor that in. Or a natural history control, which is an external control. You have the same expectation bias things. But you might be able to have more confidence, or at least as much confidence in an ultra rare disease with that kind of analysis than you would with an RCT. So 3 things, I think they're all wows. The FDAMA 115 is the way that I see almost all rare disease therapies as getting approved in the future. So that means when you start going in with your pre-IND meeting, you should be showing FDA how smart you are by not only talking about what is your clinical trial design for your pivotal study, the one pivotal trial, but talk to the FDA about how you're going to provide confirmatory evidence. Second thing, accelerated approval. I think we dodged a bullet. I think we're in good shape. I think we're going to continue to see accelerated approval do good work for the American public. And the third is the Orphan Drug Act. And my God, it's been a wonderful creature. Maybe we have to think about the ODA 2.0, think about kind of refining it a little bit along some of the things I talked about. But I think overall, I think 2022 was a great big wow. So thank you.
Well, Frank, that was just an amazing exegesis. Wow. So much to talk about there. And we have come to the end of our presentations, but we now have time for some discussion, questions. And I see some questions have been asked and answered. There may be some others coming in. We'll have Thomas put out some questions in a moment. But let's go back to that Reagan-Udall report, which was actually requested by Commissioner Califf. And they did present a model of actually taking the F out of FDA. It was not a recommendation. It was one of 5 different options that they described. But in all of those options, they had this little black box or gray box for dietary supplements. They did not say a word about dietary supplements and how they should be managed. And coming back to Kate's comment about Rob Califf's interest in evidence, what can we hope for in terms of how we apply evidence to the package around dietary supplements and helping consumers to choose wisely when they look at the hype often that is associated with marketing dietary supplements. So who would like to take that up? Riyadh, yeah, you have a thought?
You know, to start with, I can say that the evidence dietary supplements that has been, you know, is an issue if it in the current FDA or in a future food agency if dietary supplements were to go there. But the thing is that in the past, I mean, FDA has authority over substantiation, and if you make claims for dietary supplements, then the structure function claims you have to notify FDA. FDA has, in all the years, focused on if it is a valid structure function claim, which is permitted for dietary supplements, or if it is a drug claim, which of course is not permitted because that makes it a drug. The substantiation, it has left to basically the Federal Trade Commission. So that wouldn't change or wouldn't need to change if you were to move it into another agency or in another part of the agency. So, you know, I don't think that is the biggest issue that we would have to deal with if we were to, you know, create a new or a different structure in the F of FDA. Now, if you just go completely to the basics and say it's not so much the claims but evidence that we even need certain nutrients to remain healthy, you know, because some people say supplements, we don't need them. You just have a good, you know, diet, no supplements needed. Then, you know, that's a nutrition science issue. Some people, and we have some evidence, but we also have, of course, counter evidence, claim that only nutrients when they're in the food matrix and not outside the food matrix in the capsule are beneficial. And so that would be a whole different ballgame. And I don't know.
Well, yeah, I hear you. And I didn't want to hijack the discussion, but I guess my concern is that with the present structure, there is no incentive for dietary supplement manufacturers to get evidence to support even structure function claims, much less some kind of clinically meaningful claim. But I wonder, Kate, if you think that this is just a structural political problem that's never going to change, or do you see that there could be some kind of congressional action that would help us to modify our approach to dietary supplements?
Yeah, this is a little bit outside of my bandwidth, so I can't, I mean, Riyadh's probably better to comment on this, but I mean, my one thought was, you know, when those cosmetics regulations were passed, and now we have this OTC safe use pathway that's going to be coming down the pike, which is really interesting, then I think you have to then turn your focus to other areas that aren't as regulated, like dietary supplements. So I think it's really just a matter of time. And there has to be, you know, a champion sort of behind that, like we've seen with cosmetics and you know, so I think that, you know, the fact that there have been some other, there's been attention to some of these other kind of, unfortunately, tertiary parts of FDA. That means that it's only a matter of time before dietary supplements get their time to shine.
Well, that's great. Why don't we go to Thomas? And Thomas, you might pass on any questions
Sure.
that have come in.
We may
in the
need to
chat.
go into a bit sort of lightning round
Yeah,
mode.
make it lightning. These will have to be quick.
And the chat function worked well. There were questions that were asked and answered. Dean Calcagni asked, there's a lot of talk with Congress urging FDA to cooperate more with the Department of Defense. Does the panel know anything about, is this just lip service or is it something substantive going on there? And then John Wood asked about whether there's any movement to get cross-division consultation in rare diseases to make sure that there's consistency in the flexibility that's applied in rare diseases. So maybe we can address first Dean's question about FDA DoD relations.
I can say from the device side, I haven't seen it move things along any quicker with any DoD involvement. I mean, I've done battlefield use devices and things like that. And while it's helpful to have the support and the labs and the testing and all of that available from DoD, I haven't seen it make FDA move quicker.
So the absence of vigorous comment, Dean, I think means no, not yet. How about John Wood's question about Frank? Maybe you might want to take a first crack at that.
You know, what I'm hopeful for is still someday seeing a center for excellence for rare diseases, so we have more consistency across centers as well as across review divisions. But until that day comes, I haven't seen, you know, the FDA announced major programs like the ARC program last May. In June, the rare neurodegenerative disease, including ALS program. And yet I haven't seen much output from those to give me confidence that, you know, that there is actually something afoot that's going to try to get the consistency that John Wood was looking for.
Yeah, I know there was some legislation, I think it was called the STAT Act a few years ago, that would have created a rare disease center for excellence. And I think the issue there is just the will at the top, right? So we have a couple of centers of excellence so far. They take a lot to stand up and a lot of resources. And I think, you know, until you have a commissioner that really is focused on that, you're not gonna see it.
Let me offer up just a lawyer's perspective on that, and also Frank on your point about coloring outside the lines, and do we need a more formulaic approach to guide the agency? My own view is the way you can solve the consistency issue is to force FDA or encourage FDA to explain its decisions in comparison to other decisions that it's made. So the agency, you know, the reviewers, the review teams always take the position that each application is a thing unto itself, and they cannot keep track of how their principles that drive their decisions line up with how they've made other decisions. And it's completely, I think it's completely out of hand. And it's what I think puts the F in FDA frustration when you can't walk any semblance of a line through the various decisions they make. And as we get more and more approvals, it gets harder and harder to see consistency. And so what you get is a lot of approvals that seem to be the expression of the proclivities of individuals. Somebody really likes your program, and so you get the benefit of the doubt at every turn.
Yeah.
Somebody doesn't like your program, and you're spinning your wheels for years. And so until they start explaining how their thinking on one approval lines up with their thinking on the last 3 approvals that are reasonably analogous, we'll never get there.
And Dave, I think I'm going to give you an example you cited at the very top of the program, which was with Livrio. I think that's one of the things that Billy Dunn did in his opening statement on September 7th. The advisory committee said, hey, look, with respect to this flexibility that I say we're mandated to provide and implement, let's look at what we've done with our other 2 ALS approved products. Let's look at Rilotech. Let's look at Radicava. And he looked at those and he held them up and he says, this is the quantum of flexibility that we should be applying to a therapy for ALS. Now, the problem with that is that almost every therapy I'm working on is the first one for that disease. And so I like the way you just said it, because you said those that are reasonably similar. So if you look for others, that if you're talking about Pompe, where you look at other inborn errors of metabolism, Alagio, when I talked about a rare liver disease, you might look at what's been done for other rare liver conditions. So I think that would be a great step forward if the FDA would announce that. You know,
He did that a second time. The first time through, he didn't, and the advisory committee was completely at sea. Once he anchored the advisory committee in some analogous decisions, they were able to navigate. I mean, I totally agree. He addressed it head on in the briefing book.
And that's why I think that somebody, and that's why I like a Center for Excellence for Rare Diseases, I'd like somebody who has authority over all of it to say this is what we should be doing as an agency with respect to these approvals, you know, because otherwise you just get, as you said, the proclivities of the individual. This was Billy Dunn having a great insight and applying it, but is it just going to be a one-off? Because we'll never see anybody else ever pick up on that sentiment that he expressed.
I think that's where the commissioner could have a great influence. Commissioner's not supposed to be involved in approval decisions, but I think the commissioner,
yes,
and I think given Dr. Califf's expressed concerns, for example, about the lack of development for chronic diseases, I mean, a lot of that is driven by a really tough regulatory system for broad-based conditions for large populations. And I think if he could come in and say, I'm not going to get involved in individual approval decisions, but I want the divisions to explain their thinking more and why are they exercising flexibility here? How much flexibility? How does that compare with how they treated other products? I think that adding that layer of discipline to the review process would solve a lot of these issues. Now it'll create a lot of work. It's it's going to be intellectually challenging to do it, but I think it would pay off in the long run.
Isn't the question of consistency across a number of issues, decisions for sure, but within rare disease, flexibility, accelerated approval? I'm interested if anyone on the panel has any observations on trends in breakthrough therapy designation. I'm struck by the difference between the centers. The device center seems to be very innovative and progressive in handing out breakthrough designations, while the drugs at Cedar and CBER seem more rigorous, shall we say?
Well, except for oncology. I mean,
except for oncology, yep.
Right, and I feel like, you know, whenever we talk about FDA regulatory policy, it's always except for oncology, because that's where, you know, that's where breakthrough really started. So I think it's, you know, I hear what everybody is saying. I mean, FDA is we say it all the time, is an agency of individuals. And so, you know, somebody like Billy Dunn is going to get on board with your program, then then that's where they're going to, you know, you're going to be in a better place. So, you know, but breakthrough can also go away. I feel like breakthrough it felt like, at least from maybe like the Wall Street investors, as soon as breakthrough was issued, it felt like, well, this is definitely going to get approved. And we've certainly seen that hasn't been the case. So I feel like it's not as a wow as it was, you know, a number of years ago.
I would even say on the device side, it's, you know, group by group, it differs. You don't see a lot of breakthroughs coming out of radiology, but you will see them out of, you know, neurology, for example. So it's very different depending, you know, some you know, divisions we don't even try because we know it's not worth our effort. So
by the way, Kelly, we noticed that CDRH has added a criterion for their breakthrough status consideration, and that is for addressing inequities in healthcare delivery. haven't seen that on the drug side.
Yeah, and that's still in draft, and we haven't really seen how that's going to play out on the device side yet either. So still
Has
questions
anybody
about that.
seen? Well, good to know, and we're watching that carefully. But what about on the drug and biologic side? Frank and Dave, have you seen any evidence that that's coming for breakthrough as a criterion?
Yeah, I have not. I think
No, neither have I. No.
it's a great idea.
All right, Thomas, back to you.
Well, we're kind of fresh out of questions, or we're current, I guess is what I should say. So unless people want to go back to topics that we discussed, we could maybe open it up to the town hall part, because we're done. We're at the 12:30 mark, so we're done with the actual time that we said we advertised. But maybe we could invite folks to turn on your cameras, those of you who are willing, and raise hands, and we'll try to answer any quick questions.
Well, just as an observation, it's great to see a diversity of people on the call. And a lot of my friends are longstanding. I see Bill Kitchens going way back to my days in Atlanta when I was in medical school. So quite a remarkable assembly of people.
Just maybe in the chat, if people say, based on this discussion or your personal observations, do you see 2023 for the FDA as a wow or a yow? Just put W or Y into the chat, and we'll see what the sense of the audience is, please.
That is quite a composite endpoint.
Tom says, wow. Beth, Jewel. Good night to Germany.
Frank, I'd love to debate the salience of that sort of composite approach, having the summary statistic of multiple endpoints. The problem, as you know, is defining what is clinically meaningful with a number that is a composite of multiple endpoints. So something to come back.
Kind of the thing that I think I helped on a product called Mepsevi for MPS 7 for Multrogenics, which many people I think misread as having been approved on a multi-domain responder index, because in the FDA review documents it speaks of an MDRI analysis, whereas you look at each individual. There are so few individuals with the condition. You look at each individual and see if along several different instruments, they had a positive response, and you kind of try to get a sense of that. So many people try to come up with setting up a cut point, a responder cut point for each one of several different instruments, and then come up with that. But that's much more difficult to do in terms of statistics, unless then you do some sort of ranking analysis. But so the global statistics gives you an ability to come up with a z-score, to come up with a number. Okay, and then the question is, what does the number relate to? And I've had discussions with, Billy Dunn, for instance, about different products where, the disease is a unilaterally progressive disease. And what the z-score represents is actually an effect on maybe the disease is progressing 30% slower in the group that had the intervention than in the control arm. And so that's what it represents. So you're able to translate it into something meaningful, because you use the word meaningful. So there are other ways to interpret clinical meaningfulness. FDA and labeling often uses a cumulative distribution histogram, try to display meaningfulness. So yeah, this is a big topic, but I don't think this is a topic for this big group, because this.
No, I'm sorry. Sorry to get into the weeds.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, because it's too easy to distract me. As soon as you start mentioning something, I'm going to go down the rabbit hole. So I'll stop.
Yeah. Well, your words are invaluable.
Zan, can I ask a question? Take this opportunity to ask this expert panel just a question that's bugging me, I guess. with all of this innovation, we're seeing new ways to address new parts, interventions, and diseases, and it's always a challenge to get the FDA to accept a registrable endpoint or surrogate endpoints, and they want evidence for that. I'm struck again by a little bit of the difference between the device side and the drug side. But are there comments on the panel with respect to any movement with respect to ways to get clarity on endpoints, field function survival, confirmatory evidence? There's a totality of evidence. There are different ways to get FDA to approve something. But when you have an innovative approach to a disease, particularly disease modifying approaches, sometimes you're doing things you couldn't do before. And now you have to establish standards for, and it clearly seems to be doing good for the patient, but you have to validate the scale as well as the actual efficacy and safety of the approach. Is that a meaningful question or not really? Because that's always been something there for the last half century.
I would say on my experience from the device side that, yeah, the scale has to be validated. We try novel scales, but we need quite a bit of evidence to show it's validated. I think in the de novo space, there's some flexibility because the regulatory standard is the benefit outweighs the risk, right? So we get a little bit of flexibility in how we present that our benefit outweighs our risk versus having to prove safety and efficacy. So maybe you see a little more creativity in those de novo submissions.
Right. There's a question, any updates from the digital therapeutics area? That was quite the talk in BioFuture Conference, Biotech Showcase, JP Morgan in the past couple of months. Kellyanne, I suppose that would be addressed to you mostly.
Yeah, so again, I think in the digital therapeutic space, we see it in the, a lot in the de novo, kind of like the ADHD treatments. Like I mentioned, Oxford VR has, the anxious avoidance for agoraphobia, CBT breakthrough designation from FDA. So I think we're starting to see a lot more in the digital therapeutics area, rehabilitation devices, virtual reality devices, a lot, I think, in the coming year. Let's see.
Zan, what do you think? Shall we formally close the proceedings?
I guess we should, with great thanks to our panelists. It was just outstanding. Can't thank you enough. And for everybody who joined in the audience, we're so glad you did. Hope you'll come back. Also, be looking for the Healthy Longevity Conference, which is going to be coming up in a different format. So stay tuned about that. We'll be telling you more very soon. So thanks to all, and Thomas, we'll let you close it out.
Well, just to remind everyone that if you registered on Eventbrite, you will automatically get a link to the recording of this, hopefully within a couple of days. I would say thanks to the panel and the audience for your attendance and wish you all a good day and a great weekend.